What if the person who laid the foundation for our digital world never saw a light bulb glow? What if the first computer programmer was a woman working in the 1840s, whose ideas were so revolutionary they would be forgotten for a century? Her name was Augusta Ada King, Countess of Lovelace. To history, she is Ada Lovelace, and her story is one of the most extraordinary paradoxes in science. She was the daughter of Lord Byron, the most famous poet of his age, a man synonymous with romantic passion and turbulent genius. Yet she would dedicate her life to the most rigorous language of all, mathematics. In an era when women were barred from scientific institutions, she forged a partnership that conceived of a machine that could not just calculate, but create. She saw the future of computing, and then was lost to history, only to be rediscovered by the generation that would bring her vision to life. This is the story of the poet who invented computing, a mind that bridged two incompatible worlds and laid the groundwork for our digital age. The story of Ada Lovelace begins with an ending. In the cold, early months of 1816, a scandal was tearing through London high society, centered on the most celebrated and notorious literary figure of the age, George Gordon, Lord Byron. Just 1 year earlier, his marriage to the mathematically minded Annabella Milbank had been hailed as the union of two great minds, the poet of the age and the princess of parallelograms, as he teasingly called her. Their daughter, Augusta Ida, was barely 5 weeks old, but the facade of a brilliant marriage crumbled with shocking speed. The specific allegations were a toxic blend of rumor and terrifying fact. Excessive debt, intimations of violence, and most damningly the swirling gossip of an incestuous relationship with his half-sister Augusta, Lee, after whom he had named his new daughter. Annabella, methodical and morally rigid, began collecting evidence. The breaking point was likely Byron's own cruel behavior toward her, combined with her discovery of his involvement with his sister. For Annabella, a woman whose world was built on reason and propriety, this was an anvil falling, shattering the foundation of her life. Her decision was swift and final. In January 1816, she took the infant Ada and left their London home for her parents' estate, never to return as Byron's wife. The legal machinery of separation began to turn, a public and humiliating process for a man of Byron's stature. The conditions were severe. Annabella secured not only a separation, but also sole custody of Ada, with stipulations that would shape the rest of the child's life. Byron was granted no rights to his daughter's upbringing. More profoundly, the settlement included a clause designed to sever the poetic lineage. Annabella was to have absolute control over Ada's education, with the explicit intention of steering her away from the dangerous poetic impulses of her father and toward the sober, rational world of mathematics and science. Byron signed the deed of separation in April 1816 and, facing social ruin, left England forever a few days later. He would never see his daughter or his wife again. His departure was a dramatic self-styled exile, but for the child he left behind, it was an absence that would define her existence. Ada grew up in a household where her father's name was a forbidden subject, his portrait kept covered. Yet his legacy was the ghost in the room, the inherited temperament that her mother feared above all else. Annabella immediately began constructing a narrative, both for the public and for her daughter. She portrayed Byron as a monster of passion and instability, and herself as the virtuous savior. Ada was to be her masterpiece of reformation, a child raised on logic and reason, a mind so fortified by mathematics that it would be immune to the poetic madness of her bloodline. This was the birth of the Princess of Parallelograms narrative, a deliberate and calculated reframing of a child's identity before she could even speak. The anvil had fallen, and in its shadow, Annabella began to forge a new future for her daughter, one equation at a time, hoping to overwrite the poetry in her genes with the certainty of numbers. With Byron exiled, Annabella Milbank now had a clear mission: to systematically engineer a mind. She wielded absolute control over Ada's upbringing, implementing an educational regime that was as rigorous as it was deliberate. This wasn't merely about providing an education. It was about constructing a psychological defense system. Annabella believed the structured, unambiguous world of mathematics was the perfect antidote to the turbulent, imaginative world of poetry she associated with Byron. If poetry was passion and chaos, mathematics was logic and order. Her blueprint was to immerse her daughter in the latter, hoping to drown out any whisper of the former. She assembled a team of tutors, carefully selected for their intellectual rigor. The curriculum was demanding, especially for a young girl in the early 19th century. It included mathematics, of course, but also logic, science, and musical disciplines Annabella saw as reinforcing a rational worldview. The days were structured, the lessons precise. There was to be no room for idle fancy or unstructured play, which might allow her father's influence to creep in. Ada's childhood was a controlled experiment in mind-building, with Annabella as the meticulous and often oppressive lead scientist. Yet, from the beginning, the experiment produced unexpected results. The tutors reported something remarkable. Ada didn't just learn mathematics. She exhibited a genuine, innate aptitude for it. She grasped abstract concepts with a speed and depth that went beyond simple rote learning. This wasn't the passive absorption Annabella may have envisioned. It was an active, hungry intelligence engaging with the material on its own terms. This created a fundamental tension at the heart of Ada's education. Annabella's goal was control, to use mathematics as a cage for the imagination. But for Ada, mathematics was not a cage, it was a key. It unlocked a different kind of creativity, one based on pattern recognition and symbolic logic. Her letters from adolescence show a mind beginning to synthesize. She didn't see science and imagination as opposites. She saw them as two complementary ways of understanding the universe. She once wrote to her mother, "I do not believe that my father was, or ever could have been, such a poet as I shall be an analyst and metaphysician. For with me, the two go together indissolubly." This was precisely what Annabella feared. Instead of suppressing Ada's imaginative faculties, the rigorous training was giving them a new, more powerful language. Ada was becoming a hybrid thinker. The controlled environment was working too well, producing not a docile pupil of reason, but an original intellect that threatened to transcend the very boundaries Annabella had so carefully erected. The education designed to make Ada the antithesis of her father was instead forging a unique synthesis, a mind that could wield the tools of logic with the vision of a poet. The blueprint was sound, but the material it was shaping was far more complex and revolutionary than the architect had ever anticipated. This tension would define Ada's entire life, setting the stage for her future collision with a machine that was itself a perfect fusion of logic and imagination. Just as Annabella's educational regime sought to discipline Ada's mind, a different kind of confinement would profoundly shape it. Around the age of 7, Ada was struck by a mysterious and debilitating illness that left her bedridden for months. Historical records suggest everything from measles to a paralyzing condition, but the effect was unambiguous. A child whose life was already carefully controlled was now physically still, her body confined while her mind took flight in the most literal sense. It was during this long convalescence that Ada became fascinated with human flight. But this wasn't a child's idle daydream. Her analytical training immediately took over. She began a systematic study she titled Flyology, meticulously researching bird anatomy, aerodynamics, and the latest technological innovations. She filled notebooks with detailed observations and calculations, treating the problem of flight as an engineering challenge to be solved. This project culminated in her design for a steam-powered flying machine, a winged carriage complete with boiler, steam engine, and propellers. In a letter to her mother, she signed herself, "Your very affectionate carrier pigeon." This blend of rigorous scientific inquiry and playful imagination was pure Ada. Bedridden girl was designing a vehicle for physical escape, but the process itself was an intellectual escape, a fusion of her mathematical training and her innate creativity. This period of illness and isolation was critical. It forced her inward, away from the external pressures of her mother's world, and allowed her to develop her own unique mode of thought. The interplay between convalescence and creativity is a recurring theme in the lives of many visionary thinkers. For Ada, the inability to move her body seemed to accelerate the movement of her mind. She was learning to navigate abstract spaces, to manipulate complex systems in her imagination, a skill that would prove essential when she later encountered a different kind of machine that existed only on paper. The Flying Fairy project, though never built, was her first major independent intellectual achievement. It demonstrated that her mother's mathematical blueprint had not erased her imagination. It had given that imagination a new and powerful language. The girl who was kept in a room to protect her from her father's legacy was in that very confinement proving she had inherited his capacity for grand visions, even if she chose to express them through equations and engineering diagrams rather than verse. As Ada recovered and re-entered the structured world her mother had designed, she carried with her this newfound ability to bridge disciplines. Her correspondence from this period shows a mind increasingly comfortable moving between the concrete world of mathematics and the speculative realm of possibility. She began to see patterns where others saw boundaries, recognizing that the same logical principles governing mathematical equations could apply to musical composition, mechanical design, and even human thought. This synthetic thinking, born during her illness, would become her greatest intellectual gift. While her mother continued to enforce a strict regimen of mathematical study, Ada was quietly developing what she would later call poetical science, the belief that imagination and logic weren't opposites, but two essential. As Ada entered her late teens, the controlled environment of her education gave way to the equally structured world of aristocratic society. Her formal debut was a carefully managed affair, orchestrated by her mother to introduce the now polished princess of parallelograms to London's elite circles. But these were not merely social gatherings. For a woman of Ada's intellect, they were a gateway to the most thrilling salons of the era. Those were the leading scientific and philosophical minds of the day gathered to debate the latest discoveries. It was in this context that she met William King, a man who, on the surface, seemed to be the perfect match engineered by Annabella's design. He was a baron, wealthy, well-respected, and crucially deeply interested in science and agriculture. He was a safe harbor, a man of steady character who appeared to share Ada's intellectual passions, without any of the dangerous Byron-esque flamboyance her mother so feared. The courtship was practical, grounded in mutual respect and a shared standing in society. They married in July 1835, when Ada was just 19. With this union, she transitioned from Ada Byron to Ada, Countess of Lovelace. The marriage provided her with a new title, a significant fortune, and the social legitimacy of a country estate, but it also presented a new set of constraints. Society expected a countess to manage a large household, entertain guests, and produce heirs' duties that were time-consuming and often intellectually stifling. Ada gave birth to 3 children in quick succession: Byron in 1836, Annabella in 1837, and Ralph Gordon in 1839. Yet even as she fulfilled these expected roles, a profound restlessness grew within her. The mathematical studies that had defined her youth were now squeezed into the margins of her day. She maintained a vigorous correspondence with academics, seeking new problems to solve, hungering for an intellectual challenge that matched her capabilities. She was playing the part of the society wife, but her mind was yearning for a greater, more defining purpose. Her marriage had given her stability, but it had not quenched her ambition. The tension between domestic duty and intellectual hunger became increasingly apparent in her correspondence. Letters to her former tutor, Mary Somerville, reveal a woman acutely aware that her true potential was being constrained by the very life her mother had engineered for her. She wrote of struggling to concentrate on mathematical problems while surrounded by the constant demands of estate management and child rearing. Yet even within these constraints, she demonstrated remarkable resilience. turning her correspondence into a virtual salon that transcended the physical isolation of country life. She actively sought out challenging problems and engaged in detailed discussions about the latest scientific developments, proving that her intellectual fire hadn't been extinguished, only banked, waiting for the right catalyst to flare into full brilliance. This period of Ada's life represents a crucial transition. The young woman who had once designed flying machines from her sickbed was now navigating the complex social machinery of Victorian aristocracy. But the same analytical mind that had mastered calculus was now applying itself to understanding the patterns and pressures of her new world. She was learning to work within the system while secretly preparing for the moment when she could transcend it. The stage was being set for a collision between the orderly world she inhabited and the revolutionary ideas that were brewing in her mind. All she needed was the right spark, and that spark would arrive in the form of an eccentric inventor named Charles Babbage and his extraordinary, unfinished machine. Life at Occam Park, the King family's country estate, presented a paradox for Ada. She was now the mistress of a grand household, a role demanding immense administrative skill. Her days were filled with the management of servants, the oversight of farms, and the complex social obligations of her station. This was the life her mother had envisioned for her, one of respectable, aristocratic domesticity. Yet for a mind accustomed to wrestling with calculus and abstract logic, the mundane details of estate management could feel like a cage. The intellectual energy that had once been channeled into flyology was now consumed by ledgers and guest lists. The birth of her 3 children, Byron, Annabella, and Ralph Gordon, brought its own profound demands. Motherhood in the Victorian era was an all-consuming responsibility, particularly for a woman of her class. Her correspondence from this period reveals a constant tension. Letters to her former tutor, Mary Somerville, and other academic acquaintances are filled with apologies for delayed replies, citing domestic duties that had kept her from her mathematical studies. She was acutely aware that her intellectual pursuits were being pushed to the margins of her life, becoming a luxury she had to fight for. In one letter, she lamented the difficulty of concentrating on a mathematical problem while surrounded by the constant needs of a young family. But Ada was not a woman to surrender her ambitions quietly. She turned her correspondence into a lifeline, a virtual salon that transcended the physical isolation of the country estate. She actively sought out new intellectual challenges, asking for difficult problems to solve and engaging in detailed discussions about the latest scientific developments. She understood that to remain intellectually vital, she needed a project, a purpose that could focus her formidable abilities. This growing sense of restlessness was not a rejection of her family, but a deep-seated need to fulfill the potential her education had unlocked. The estate provided comfort and status, but it could not contain her hunger for a greater contribution. She was navigating the narrow path available to a woman of her time, performing the duties of a countess while her mind reached for something far beyond the boundaries of Occam Park. The stage was set for a catalyst, and it would arrive in the form of an eccentric inventor and his extraordinary, unfinished machine. That catalyst arrived through the most unlikely of channels, a book series intended to reconcile science and religion. In 1837, while managing her household duties at Occam Park, Ada immersed herself in the Bridgewater Treatises, works commissioned to demonstrate divine wisdom through scientific discovery. Her mentor, the renowned scientist Mary Somerville, was herself contributing to this intellectual project. Through their correspondence about these treatises, Somerville recognized Ada's restless intellect needed more substantial nourishment than philosophical debates could provide. It was through this connection that Somerville arranged a pivotal introduction. She brought Ada to one of Charles Babbage's legendary London soirees gatherings where the era's most brilliant minds witnessed demonstrations of his extraordinary calculating machines. The moment Ada laid eyes on the small working portion of Babbage's difference engine, her world shifted irrevocably. While other guests saw an elaborate curiosity of brass gears and polished steel, Ada saw something entirely different, a manifestation of pure logic. Babbage, accustomed to polite incomprehension from most visitors, immediately recognized a different quality of attention from this young woman. Where others saw mechanics, she perceived mathematics in motion. He explained the machine's operation, how its intricate arrangement of gears could calculate polynomial functions with perfect accuracy. Most listeners would have nodded politely. Ada began asking questions that cut straight to the philosophical core of the invention. She grasped not just how it worked, but what it represented, the automation of thought itself. Their intellectual chemistry was immediate and profound. Babbage, often irascible and impatient with those who couldn't keep pace with his thinking, found in Ada a mind that not only understood his work, but could engage with it on its deepest conceptual level. For Ada, Babbage represented everything missing from her life at Occam Park: direct access to the cutting edge of scientific innovation, and a thinker whose vision matched her own expansive imagination. But the difference engine was merely the prelude. Babbage was already designing something far more revolutionary, a machine he called the analytical engine. Where the difference engine performed a single type of calculation, this new machine would be capable of any computation. It would have memory, a central processing unit, and most astonishingly, programmability through punched cards adapted from the Jacquard loom. The concept existed primarily in Babbage's mind and scattered drawings, yet Ada understood its implications with startling clarity. She recognized that this wasn't just a better calculator, it was something entirely new in human history. A machine that could manipulate symbols according to rules. A device that could, in principle, process any information that could be represented symbolically. While Babbage focused on the formidable engineering challenges, Ada saw the metaphysical implications. She understood that the analytical engine's true power lay not in its brass and steel, but in its capacity to execute logical operations, to compute in the modern sense of the word. Their correspondence began immediately after that first meeting, letters flying between Babbage's London workshop and Ada's country estate. She devoured his explanations, asked increasingly sophisticated questions, and began speculating about applications he hadn't considered. The princess of parallelograms had found her kingdom not in the drawing rooms of aristocracy, but in the abstract space between mathematics and machinery. The restless intellectual energy that had been constrained by domesticity now had its focus. The bridge between her mathematical training and her imaginative vision was being built, gear by conceptual gear, in the form of a machine that existed only on paper, but was already taking shape in her mind. The machine that captivated Ada Lovelace was unlike anything the world had ever conceived. Charles Babbage's analytical engine was not merely an improvement on his earlier difference engine. It was a conceptual leap into a new realm of possibility. While the difference engine was a sophisticated calculator, bound to a single task, the analytical engine was designed as a universal machine. Its architecture, all on paper, contained the fundamental components of every computer that would follow a century later, a mechanical prophecy of the digital age. At its heart were two main units that prefigured modern computing architecture: the mill and the store. The store was the memory, a vast array of vertical axes, each holding a number composed of stacked gears. Babbage envisioned it holding up to 1,000 numbers, a colossal memory for a mechanical device. The mill was the central processing unit, a complex symphony of gears, levers, and camshafts where the actual arithmetic operations would be performed. Data would travel between the store and the mill on a system of racks and pinions, a physical data bus transmitting information across the machine. But the true genius, and the element that most fascinated Ada, was the control system. The engine was to be programmed using punched cards, an idea Babbage adapted from the Jacquard loom, which used cards to weave intricate patterns in fabric. As modern research into animated visualizations reveals, these cards functioned like early machine code. There were two types: number cards to input data, and operation cards to dictate the sequence of actions. These cards would allow the machine to make decisions, to perform conditional branching, where the next step would depend on the result of a previous calculation. This meant the machine could execute loops, repeat operations, and follow a logical path that wasn't predetermined. It wasn't just calculating, it was computing. For most observers, this was an impossibly complex mechanical puzzle. But Ada possessed a unique cognitive gift. She could look past the brass and steel, past the intricate clockwork, and see the abstract logic that gave the machine its soul. While Babbage, the engineer, focused on the formidable challenge of building the physical apparatus, Ada grasped the conceptual framework. She understood that the engine's operations were not about numbers per se, but about the manipulation of symbols. The numbers were just one type of symbol the machine could process. This was her fundamental insight, borne out by analysis of their correspondence. The real challenge wasn't explaining how the gears turned. It was explaining what those turning gears represented. The machine existed in a kind of conceptual space, and Ada had the ability to navigate that space with a clarity that even its inventors sometimes lacked. She saw that the analytical engine was an embodiment of abstract operations, a physical manifestation of an algorithm. The fact that it didn't yet exist as a working model was almost irrelevant. Its logic was real, and to her, that logic was everything. The coordination of this entire system was managed by complex control mechanisms centered around barrels large, rotating cylinders studded with movable pegs, similar to those in a music box. As detailed in modern animated reconstructions, these barrels would have been extraordinarily intricate, with 50 to 80 pegs each to activate the numerous levers required for different operations. They controlled the timing of when numbers were transferred, when operations commenced, and when cards were advanced, essentially functioning as the machine's clock cycle, its internal rhythm. For Ada Lovelace, these mechanical intricacies were less important than the abstract logic they represented. While Babbage was consumed with engineering challenges like the anticipating carriage mechanism for handling arithmetic operations, Lovelace saw the components as symbols of a deeper truth. The store was not just a collection of gears. It was a repository for variables. The mill was not just a complex gearbox. It was a processor of abstract operations. The punched cards were not just holes in paper. They were a language. She realized that the machine's true power lay in this abstraction. Because the operations were symbolic, the numbers being manipulated didn't have to represent quantities. They could represent musical notes, alphabetical letters, or any other symbol system. The engine, in her view, was a machine for manipulating relationships, not just crunching numbers. This understanding allowed her to envision applications that went far beyond Babbage's initial focus on producing mathematical tables. He thought of the engine as a practical tool for navigation and engineering. She saw a potential that was almost philosophical, a machine that could, in theory, compose music or create graphics by manipulating symbolic relationships. The sheer scale of the proposed machine was breathtaking. Babbage's designs called for a store capable of holding 1,000 numbers of 50 digits, each that's 50,000 decimal digits of memory, a massive amount for a mechanical device. The entire apparatus would have filled a large room, powered by a steam engine. Yet for Ada, the physical reality was secondary to the conceptual breakthrough. The analytical engine represented something entirely new, a general-purpose machine whose function was determined by its instructions, not its construction. It was this vision of programmability, the separation of hardware from software, that would make her notes so revolutionary when they finally reached the world. For years, Ada Lovelace's correspondence with Charles Babbage had been a private intellectual feast, a meeting of two minds wrestling with a machine that existed only in theory. But in 1842, an opportunity arrived that would transform their private collaboration into public legacy. An Italian military engineer and future Prime Minister, Luigi Menabrea, attended one of Babbage's lectures on the analytical engine in Turin. Captivated, he published a detailed description of the machine in a Swiss journal, Bibliothèque Universelle de Genève. The article, written in French, was technically sound but fundamentally descriptive. It explained the engine as mechanics without grasping its deeper philosophical implications, the very implications that had so fascinated Ada. When a copy of Manabria's memoir reached Ada at Ockham Park, she recognized its potential immediately, but also its limitations. Here was the first major publication on the analytical engine, a chance to introduce this revolutionary concept to a wider European audience. She proposed to Babbage that she translate it into English. Babbage agreed, but then made a suggestion that would change history. He knew Manabria's work was a skeleton. It needed flesh and blood. He casually remarked that Ada might add a few notes to the translation to clarify certain points. This modest suggestion ignited something in her. What began as a simple translation swiftly expanded into a project of monumental ambition. Ada's few notes would eventually dwarf Manabria's original article, growing to nearly 3 times its length. She didn't just want to clarify, she wanted to illuminate. She saw this as her opportunity to articulate the vision that had been growing in her mind for years to explain not just how the machine worked, but what it meant. This was her moment to step out of the shadow of mentorship and into the scientific record on her terms. The scale of the task was immense. For nearly a year, she worked with obsessive focus, her health often faltering under the strain. As modern analysis of their correspondence reveals, she engaged in an intense back and forth with Babbage, drafting and redrafting, refining her explanations, and pushing him to clarify his own thinking. She wasn't merely his amanuensis. She was his interpreter, his philosopher, and in many ways, his visionary. She was constructing a bridge of understanding between Babbage's engineering genius and the world. Her work process was methodical and deeply analytical, drawing on the mathematical training she had received from Augustus de Morgan. She treated the translation as both a technical and philosophical project, ensuring every term was precise while also expanding on concepts Manabria had only briefly mentioned. The famous Bernoulli numbers algorithm emerged from this process not as a casual addition, but as a deliberate demonstration of the engine's full capabilities. She chose this particular mathematical sequence precisely because its computation required recursion and conditional operations that would showcase the machine as programmability. In an era when women were systematically excluded from the official annals of science, this annotated translation was her shot at etching her ideas, her voice, and her name onto the foundation of a new field. The work would be published under her initials, AAL, a common practice for women wishing to participate in scientific discourse without immediate prejudice. But the identity behind those initials would soon become an open secret in intellectual circles. She was no longer just a translator. She was becoming the author of the most important commentary on computing that the 19th century would ever produce. The Princess of Parallelograms was preparing to present her vision to the world, knowing that this work might be her only chance to achieve a form of immortality in a field that had no place for women. In what would become known as Note A, Ada Lovelace made her philosophical stand, the conceptual leap that separated the analytical engine from every calculating device that had come before it. While Manabria's original article described the machine's mechanics, Ada's first major note articulated its soul. She began by drawing a crucial distinction that most readers, and perhaps even Babbage himself in his engineering focus, had overlooked. The difference engine was a marvel, but a marvel of singular purpose built to compute polynomial functions, to produce mathematical tables. Its entire existence was defined by calculation. The analytical engine was something categorically different. It was not merely a calculator. It was the first conception of a general-purpose computer. Its operations, she argued, were not bound to arithmetic alone. The machine was designed to act upon any form of symbolic logic. The numbers it manipulated were just one instance of things that could be represented. The true subject of the engine's operation was not quantity, but abstract entities. It could process symbols according to rules. This was the fundamental leap. She saw that the machine's essence was its ability to execute a sequence of operations, a program that could be applied to any set of symbols that could be clearly defined. This insight led her to the engine's most profound capability, its ability to act upon its own creations. Because the machine could store intermediate results and use those results to determine its next actions, it could, in a sense, build upon what it had already done. It wasn't just following a fixed path. It was navigating a logical landscape. This capacity for conditional branching and looping meant its behavior could be dynamic, its output not merely the final answer to a sum, but a new construction born from logical process. It was this line of thinking that allowed her to make her most visionary prophecies. If the machine could manipulate any symbols, then why should they only be numbers? She posited that the engine might act upon other things besides number, were objects found whose mutual fundamental relations could be expressed by those of the abstract science of operations. She suggested it could compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent. It could create graphics. It could, in theory, manipulate any system of logic. She was laying the groundwork, a century early, for the entire theoretical field of computer science, describing a machine that was Turing complete before Alan Turing was born. Note A was her declaration that they were no longer just building a bigger calculator. They were defining the principles of a new kind of machine, one that could extend the power of the human mind itself by automating the process of logical thought. This philosophical foundation would support every subsequent development in computing, from the first electronic computers to the artificial intelligence systems of our own time. Ada had grasped the essential truth that computation is fundamentally about information processing, not number crunching, an insight so profound that it would take the computing industry another 100 years to fully appreciate its implications. If Note A contained the philosophical manifesto, then Note G was the practical demonstration, the moment of pure creation where theory became concrete instruction. This was where Ada Lovelace moved from visionary prophecy to practical engineering, and in doing so, authored what is now universally recognized as the first published computer program. The challenge she set for herself was deliberately ambitious: to illustrate the engine's full capabilities with a problem complex enough to require its sophisticated architecture. She chose to compute a sequence of Bernoulli numbers, a brilliant selection that revealed her deep mathematical understanding. Bernoulli numbers appear throughout number theory and calculus, describing coefficients in various mathematical series. Their computation involves complex recursive formulas that build upon previous results in a cascading pattern. For human calculators, they were notoriously tedious to derive. But for a machine capable of storing intermediate results and looping through operations, they represented the perfect test case. Modern analysis of her correspondence shows this was no arbitrary choice. She selected Bernoulli numbers precisely because their calculation would demonstrate the analytical engine's ability to handle recursion and conditional logic, showcasing features that distinguished it from mere calculators. Her description in Note G is meticulous in its precision. She didn't just present the final mathematical formula. She wrote out, in exhaustive detail, the exact sequence of operations the analytical engine would need to perform. She described how numbers would be moved from the store to the mill, what arithmetic operation would be executed, and where the result would be placed next. She outlined the loops, the repetitive cycles the machine would follow, with the number of iterations determined by the calculation itself. Most remarkably, she described conditional branches, points where the machine's next step would depend on whether a previous result met specific conditions. This wasn't a mere description of a calculation. It was an algorithm in the modern sense, a set of unambiguous instructions for a processor to follow. The precision of her thinking separates this work from simple mathematical commentary. She was essentially writing in a language the machine would understand, a language of operations and memory addresses. She had to think like the machine itself, anticipating every step, every data transfer, every potential state. This required a profound understanding of both the mathematical problem and the logical architecture of the engine. As modern scholars analyzing the Lovelace-Babbage correspondence have noted, she wasn't just using the machine as a calculator. She was programming it, defining a process that could be executed automatically. Why does this sequence constitute the first computer program? Because it meets all the modern criteria we now associate with programming. It's a series of step-by-step instructions designed to be carried out automatically by a machine. It involves iteration and conditional branching, the fundamental constructs that distinguish programming from simple calculation. And critically, it was written for a general-purpose computer whose function could be changed by altering the program, not a single-purpose calculator hardwired for one task. While Babbage had written algorithmic fragments in his private notebooks, Ada's Note G was the first complete, published, and fully realized algorithm intended for a general-purpose computer. It was a blueprint for computation that would remain unmatched for nearly a century. This achievement demonstrates the perfect synthesis of her unique mind. The poet's daughter brought the creative vision to see the engine's potential for tasks like music composition. The analyst, forged by her mother's rigorous education, provided the logical framework to make that vision executable. In Note G, these two halves became one coherent whole. She used the language of mathematics not just to solve a problem, but to communicate with a machine, to instruct an intelligence of gears and levers in performing complex, multi-step operations. It was an active translation between human thought and mechanical process, establishing a foundation that every programmer who followed would build upon. The algorithm itself reveals her sophisticated understanding of computational efficiency. She didn't merely translate the mathematical formula into mechanical steps. She optimized the process for the engine's architecture. She arranged operations to minimize data movement between the store and the mill, recognizing that transportation of numbers would be one of the engine's slower processes. She structured the calculation to reuse intermediate results efficiently, demonstrating an understanding of what we now call computational complexity. This attention to practical implementation shows she wasn't just theorizing, she was engineering a solution within the constraints of a real, albeit unbuilt machine. Perhaps most remarkably, she included what modern programmers would recognize as an optimization note, an explanation of why she chose a particular computational approach over alternatives. She acknowledged that the Bernoulli numbers could be calculated in different ways, but she selected the method best suited to the analytical engine's capabilities. This meta-commentary on her own algorithm shows she was thinking not just about getting the right answer, but about the most elegant and efficient way for the machine to arrive at that answer. It has the kind of consideration that separates competent programmers from truly great ones: ability to think about the thinking of the machine. The creation of this algorithm under such constrained circumstances makes it all the more impressive. She developed it without the benefit of ever seeing the engine work, without being able to test her program on an actual machine, and without the debugging tools that modern programmers take for granted. She had to simulate the entire computational process in her mind, tracking variable states and operation sequences through pure mental effort. The fact that her algorithm was later verified as correct by modern computer scientists testifies to the extraordinary clarity and precision of her thinking. In Note G, Ada Lovelace didn't just write a program, she invented the very activity of programming. She demonstrated that creating software required a new way of thinking, breaking down complex problems into discrete, sequential steps, managing memory and processing resources, and designing logical flows that could adapt to different computational states. She established that programming was not merely a technical skill, but a creative discipline that combined mathematical rigor with imaginative problem-solving. Her work on the Bernoulli numbers algorithm remains a masterpiece of computational thinking, a bridge between the abstract world of mathematics and the practical world of machine execution that would define the next century of technological progress. This fusion of logic and imagination, of analysis and poetry, found its ultimate expression in what Ada Lovelace called poetical science, a phrase that perfectly captured her most profound insight about the analytical engine's true nature. While Babbage remained primarily focused on what the machine did, its mechanical operations and arithmetic capabilities, Ada was captivated by what it could be. Her vision extended far beyond the calculation of numbers into realms that were, for her time, pure speculation, yet which now seem remarkably prescient. She famously prophesied that the engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent. This was not a casual aside, but a radical leap grounded in her understanding of music as fundamentally mathematical, a system of logical relationships between notes, harmonies, and rhythms that could be represented symbolically. If the engine could manipulate symbols according to rules, then it could, in theory, manipulate the symbols of music. She saw that the same logical framework used for mathematics could generate art, anticipating computer-generated music and digital art by more than a century. Even more visionary was her concept of the machine building upon its own creations through what we now call recursive operations. She described how the engine could take its computational results and use them as the basis for new operations, creating chains of intellectual production that weren't merely calculation but a form of automated reasoning. This wasn't just number crunching. It was a mechanical mind capable of generative thought, processing information in layers that built upon previous outputs. This led her directly to the edge of the most profound question: could such a machine ever truly think? Her answer became famous as Lovelace's objection, the argument that the engine has no pretensions to originate anything. It can only do whatever we know how to order it to perform. This distinction between processing and true origination became a cornerstone of artificial intelligence debates a century later. She recognized that while the machine could execute instructions with superhuman speed and precision, it lacked consciousness, intention, or true creativity. It could follow a score, but couldn't feel the music. The power of her vision lies in its humanity. She saw the engine not as a replacement for human intellect, but as its most powerful extension, a tool to amplify human creativity by handling computational drudgery, freeing the mind for higher-level conceptual work. Her notes transformed the analytical engine from a fascinating mechanical oddity into a symbol of intellectual potential, articulating a future where boundaries between science, art, and mathematics could be traversed by machines that understood their underlying logic. In doing so, she didn't just document a machine. She authored the first chapter in the philosophy of the digital age, establishing a vision of human-machine collaboration that we are still working to fulfill today. In 1843, Sketch of the Analytical Engine appeared in Taylor's scientific memoirs under the discrete initials AAL. The veil of anonymity was thin, however, and her identity as Ada Augusta Lovelace soon became an open secret within intellectual circles. The reaction revealed more about Victorian science than about her work itself. The scientific establishment responded with a mixture of bafflement and dismissal. Many were simply unprepared for concepts this radical, a machine manipulating symbols rather than calculating numbers, mechanical music composition. These ideas strained the scientific imagination of an era still grappling with steam power and telegraphs. Some mathematicians respected the technical achievement of the Bernoulli algorithm, but dismissed her philosophical speculations as feminine fancy. The fact that the engine remained unbuilt made it easy for critics to label the entire project as speculative fantasy. When her identity became known, the criticism took on a different character. A woman, and an aristocratic woman at that, simply couldn't possess such profound insight into mechanical engineering. Her work was framed as merely explanatory, a skilled popularization of Babbage's genius rather than original contribution. The gender dynamics of Victorian science ensured she would be remembered as a translator and socialite rather than the visionary she was. Babbage's reaction was equally revealing. He praised her work publicly, calling her notes superior to his own explanations. But privately, their relationship showed subtle strains. The man accustomed to being the sole visionary for his grand project now shared the spotlight with a collaborator whose interpretation sometimes surpassed his own. He remained frustrated by the government's funding refusal, and Ada's brilliant exposition did nothing to solve his practical problems. For Ada, the publication brought both triumph and isolation. She had poured her intellect into this work, achieving something no woman had before: a substantial contribution to advanced mathematics and engineering. Yet the world's response was muted. The engine remained a paper dream, and the scientific establishment remained largely closed to her. She had reached the pinnacle of her intellectual life, only to find the summit strangely lonely, with no clear path forward and no institution that would recognize her genius on its own terms. The intellectual harmony that produced the 1843 paper could not survive the harsh realities of funding and frustration. The brilliant collaboration between Lovelace and Babbage began to fracture under the weight of practical failure, financial desperation, and two formidable personalities pulling in different directions. The root cause was simple and devastating. The British government had definitively withdrawn its funding for the analytical engine after decades of investment in Babbage's earlier difference engine. Babbage, who had poured his personal fortune and the prime years of his life into the project, became increasingly bitter and obsessive. His frustration curdled into a singular fixation that left little room for the nuanced philosophical partnership they had once enjoyed. Ada saw the problem through a different lens. She believed the engine needed more than just mechanical refinement. It required a coherent strategy for public engagement and financial support. Drawing on her aristocratic connections and social acumen, she attempted to step into the role of manager and promoter. She proposed practical business models, suggested specific applications to attract investors, and tried to mediate between Babbage's technical perfectionism and the practical concerns of potential patrons. But Babbage, the stubborn inventor, proved a terrible partner in these diplomatic efforts. He resisted compromise, dismissed what he saw as commercial vulgarity, and often undermined her delicate negotiations with his famously confrontational approach. Their correspondence from this period reveals the growing estrangement. Where once their letters had brimmed with exciting speculations about the engine's philosophical implications, they now became bogged down in logistical arguments and financial schemes that went nowhere. Ada grew increasingly frustrated with what she perceived as Babbage's inability to see beyond his workshop. He, in turn, seemed to resent her attempts to manage his life's work, perhaps viewing her interventions as amateur meddling in matters she didn't fully grasp. The dynamic shifted from intellectual equals to a frustrated benefactor and a resistant genius. The final symbolic rupture came with a disastrous gambling scheme. Desperate to raise the enormous funds needed to build the engine themselves, they concocted a plan to use mathematical probability systems to win at horse racing. It was a catastrophic miscalculation that perfectly captured their diverging approaches. Ada saw it as a practical, if risky, application of mathematical principles to a real-world problem. Babbage, the pure theorist, approached it as an abstract puzzle. The scheme failed spectacularly, costing them both significant money and shredding the last vestiges of professional trust between them. Modern analysis of their correspondence shows this gambling episode wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of months of deteriorating collaboration. Letters that once discussed mathematical proofs and mechanical designs now contain tense exchanges about money, credit, and conflicting strategies. The personal and professional distance widened into an unbridgeable chasm. The two visionaries who had together glimpsed the future of computing now found they could barely work together at all, their partnership becoming another casualty of a machine that remained forever out of reach, a dream destroyed by the very real-world constraints they had tried to transcend through mathematics and machinery. The failure of the racing scheme with Babbage was more than just a professional embarrassment. It triggered a personal catastrophe that would consume Ada's final years. while Babbage could retreat to his workshop, nursing his pride and his unfinished engines. Ada found herself in a far more precarious position. The mathematical model she had developed for betting, which she believed could predict outcomes with scientific certainty, had proven disastrously flawed. But rather than abandon the idea, she doubled down. Convinced the problem lay in execution rather than theory, she formed a gambling syndicate with a group of young aristocratic men, pouring what remained of her own money into the venture. Her approach was characteristically analytical. She kept meticulous ledgers, treating each bet as a data point in a grand experiment. She was attempting to impose mathematical order on the chaotic world of chance, to tame randomness with logic. In her mind, this wasn't recklessness, it was applied science. She wrote to a friend that she had discovered a law governing the races, a system that would ultimately prove infallible. But the horses, unlike the gears of the analytical engine, did not obey the laws of pure logic. The syndicate began to hemorrhage money. The scale of the losses quickly became staggering. By 1850, her debts had ballooned to thousands of pounds, a fortune equivalent to millions today. In a desperate attempt to cover the mounting losses and hide the scandal from her husband William King, she resorted to pawning the Lovelace family jewels. This act of desperation crossed a line from risky speculation into a breach of trust that threatened the very foundation of her family as financial security and social standing. The syndicate collapsed, leaving her solely responsible for the debts. The secret was now impossible to keep. The revelation of her gambling debts caused a seismic rupture in her life. William King was horrified, both by the financial ruin and the social disgrace. The respectable, scientifically minded baron she had married found himself entangled in a sordid scandal that threatened his reputation and his estate. The tension in their marriage, always present beneath the surface of their intellectual partnership, now erupted into the open. Her health, always fragile, deteriorated rapidly under the immense strain of financial terror, marital strife, and the shame of public exposure. This episode represents the tragic collision of her greatest strength and her most profound vulnerability. The same analytical mind that could envision the future of computing became tragically misapplied in a desperate search for certainty and control. The gambling was, in a sense, an attempt to find a practical outlet for her intellectual power, a way to achieve the financial independence and recognition that her gender and station otherwise denied her. But the real world of risk and chance proved far less predictable than the abstract world of mathematics. The scandal left her financially broken, socially isolated, and physically broken. A brilliant mind trapped in a vortex of her own making. With the shadow of the father she never knew, the famously reckless Lord Byron, finally falling fully upon her. The financial and emotional devastation of the gambling scandal proved catastrophic for Ada's already fragile health, accelerating a physical decline that had been progressing for years. By 1851, what began as persistent fatigue and abdominal discomfort sharpened into unbearable, specific pain that left her bedridden for weeks at a time. Her physicians diagnosed uterine cancer, a brutal sentence in the Victorian era, when medical science offered little beyond palliative opiates, and brutal, experimental interventions that often caused more suffering than the disease itself. Her medical care became a new form of confinement, more restrictive than her childhood sickroom or the social constraints of aristocracy. Victorian oncology relied on horrific treatments that modern medical historians describe as medieval: bleeding, blistering, and dangerous purgatives prescribed by doctors who could do little more than guess at the source of her agony. The woman who had once designed flying machines and commanded complex algorithms was now reduced to a patient, her world shrinking to the dimensions of her sickroom, her brilliant mind trapped within a body that was systematically failing her. As her physical strength waned, a different kind of confinement took hold. Her mother, Lady Annabella, returned with formidable force to dominate her daughter's life one final time. Seizing upon Ada's illness as both a crisis and an opportunity, Annabella took complete control of her care, her household, and her correspondence. She dismissed Ada's friends, particularly those she deemed bad influences from the gambling circles, and installed her own doctors and nurses. The sickroom became a fortress, with Annabella as its stern gatekeeper, determined to manage not only her daughter's body, but her legacy and final spiritual state. Yet in these final, pain-racked months, a profound and poignant reconciliation occurred between mother and daughter. The lifelong struggle between Annabella's rigid moral calculus and Ada's expansive, poetic science finally found a fragile peace. Facing mortality, the intellectual and emotional chasm that had defined their relationship began to close. Ada, in her suffering, turned to the mother who had always sought to control her, and Annabella, in turn, offered a devotion that was perhaps her purest expression of love, less about molding and more about comforting. Despite the agony and the heavy medications meant to dull it, Ada fought to maintain her legendary intellectual clarity. She continued to correspond when strength allowed, her letters becoming shorter but no less sharp, discussing mathematical concepts and scientific developments almost until the end. She was determined to face her fate with the same analytical precision she had applied to every other challenge in her life, treating her own deterioration as a final problem to be observed and understood rather than merely endured. Yet in her final act of self-determination, she made a request that reached beyond reason and into the realm of poetry. She asked to be buried not in the King family plot, alongside the husband who represented the respectable life her mother had engineered for her, but next to the father she had never known. In the Byron family vault at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene in Hucknall, the princess of parallelograms would finally be reunited with the mad, bad, and dangerous to know poet, a symbolic completion of the paradoxical arc of her extraordinary life, embracing both the analytical rigor of her mother's world and the imaginative fire of her father's legacy in death, as she never could in life. With Ida's death on November 27, 1852, control over her story passed irrevocably to the one person who had sought to shape it from the beginning, her mother, Annabella. The reconciliation in the sickroom had been genuine, but it did not erase a lifetime of calculation. Annabella now launched a final aggressive campaign to secure the legacy not of the visionary scientist, but of the redeemed daughter. Her mission was to systematically erase the passionate, ambitious, and scandal-tainted woman and replace her with a narrative of pious resignation and mathematical virtue. The primary tool for this rewriting of history was Ada's own correspondence. Annabella and a trusted aide embarked on a methodical process of reviewing and censoring thousands of letters. Correspondence that revealed Ada's gambling debts, her frustrations with Babbage, her marital struggles, and the full force of her intellectual ambitions were selectively destroyed or heavily edited. The goal was to create a curated archive that presented Ada as a tragic figure who had valiantly used mathematics to suppress her dangerous Byron inheritance, a woman whose greatest achievement was not her visionary work, but her ultimate moral victory over her own nature. This posthumous narrative emphasized piety over passion, duty over genius. Annabella circulated accounts of Ada's devout Christian faith in her final days, framing her life as a spiritual struggle she had nobly won. The brilliant, complex author of the Notes on the Analytical Engine was reduced to a cautionary tale about the redemptive power of reason. The Princess of Parallelograms persona, once a label of intellectual distinction, was now repurposed as evidence of a mind successfully disciplined against poetic excess. Even Ada's mathematical work was presented not as original genius, but as evidence of her successful resistance to her father's dangerous legacy. Yet Ada, even in death, managed one final act of profound symbolism that subtly defied her mother's control. At her request, she was buried not in the King family plot, alongside the husband who represented the respectable life her mother had engineered for her. Instead, she was interred in the Byron family vault at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene in Hucknall, next to the father she had never met. In this single powerful gesture, the poet's daughter claimed her birthright. It was a silent but unmistakable declaration that her identity was an inseparable fusion of both legacies, analytical rigor of her mother's world, and the imaginative fire of her father. The arc of her life, so full of paradox, was thus completed not with a period of moral certainty, but with an ellipsis of unresolved tension, leaving her true story waiting to be rediscovered by a future that might better understand the revolutionary nature of her vision. Following her burial, a profound silence descended upon Ada Lovelace's work. The brilliant light of her 1843 notes, which had illuminated the future of computing, seemed to flicker and fade into the dim archives of a century-long obscurity. The immediate cause was simple and brutal. The analytical engine itself never materialized. Babbage continued to tinker and refine his designs until his death in 1871. But the British government had long since withdrawn its support. The magnificent machine remained a collection of beautiful drawings and partial models, theoretical curiosity with no practical application to anchor it in the technological imagination of the age. Without the physical engine to validate its principles, the entire project began to look like an expensive, eccentric fantasy. The 19th century was an era of tremendous industrial progress, but it was progress of steam, steel, and electricity, tangible technologies that transformed daily life. The abstract concept of general-purpose computation, of a machine that manipulated symbols rather than just calculating numbers, found no purchase in a world that couldn't yet conceive of its need. The very language Ada used to describe the engine's potential, its capacity for music composition or graphical creation, sounded less like prophecy and more like the fanciful speculation of an amateur, easily dismissed by a scientific establishment focused on practical results and measurable outcomes. The careful curation of her legacy by her mother, Annabella, had an unintended consequence that deepened this obscurity. By scrubbing Ada's correspondence of its scientific passion and intellectual ambition, the public record was left with a sanitized version of a pious, mathematically inclined woman. This portrayal effectively buried the sheer audacity of her original thought. She was remembered, if at all, as Lord Byron's eccentric daughter who had dabbled in mathematics, not as the co-architect of a radical new field of science. The complex, visionary thinker was reduced to a simple morality tale about overcoming hereditary madness through mathematical discipline. For nearly 100 years, the history of computing was written without her. Textbooks chronicled the mechanical calculators of the 19th century and then leaped forward to the electronic giants of the mid-20th, ENIAC and the Colossus. Babbage was remembered as a fascinating, tragic failure, the man who almost invented the computer. But the woman who had first understood what that computer could truly be was relegated to a footnote, her profound contributions lost in the shadow of the machine that was never built and the father who was too famous. Her work wasn't debated or criticized. It was simply, utterly forgotten, a sealed blueprint for a future that had not yet arrived, waiting in archives and private collections for a generation that would finally understand what she had seen. The silence surrounding Ada Lovelace's work lasted for the better part of a century, a period when the very idea of a programmable computer seemed like a historical curiosity. But the seeds she had planted in the 1840s were merely dormant, waiting for the right conditions to germinate. Those conditions arrived with the chaos of World War II, when the need to break enemy codes forced a technological revolution that would bring her vision back to life. In hushed, secret facilities like Bletchley Park, the theoretical became terrifyingly practical. Machines with names like Colossus, built from vacuum tubes and wire, were created to perform logical operations at incredible speeds. The age of electronic computing had begun, and with it, the need for a theoretical foundation to understand what these new machines could truly do. It was in this new context that a young, brilliant, and profoundly unconventional mathematician named Alan Turing began his work. While grappling with the deepest questions of computation and intelligence, Turing delved into the prehistory of his field. In the 1843 edition of Taylor's Scientific Memoirs, he discovered Ada Lovelace's notes on the analytical engine. For Turing, this was not a dusty relic. It was a lightning strike. Here was a thinker from a century before who had already mapped the philosophical territory he was now exploring. He found himself confronting her most provocative idea, what he would later formally call Lady Lovelace's objection in his seminal 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. Her objection was stark in its clarity. The analytical engine has no pretensions to originate anything. It can do whatever we know how to order it to perform. In the midst of designing his own universal computing machine and pondering whether such machines could ever think, Turing found this century-old challenge waiting for him. It became a central pivot point in the debate about artificial intelligence. Turing's response was as ingenious as it was revolutionary. He argued that the line between following instructions and originating ideas was far blurrier than it appeared. A machine could be programmed with a capacity for learning, allowing it to modify its own instructions based on experience. In doing so, it could produce results that its programmers did not explicitly foresee. This directly engaged with Lovelace's core distinction, transforming her objection from a definitive rebuttal into a foundational problem for the new field of artificial intelligence. What's remarkable is how perfectly Lovelace's framework anticipated the questions Turing would face. She had already distinguished between the machine's capacity for processing information and the human capacity for conscious understanding. She saw that while machines could execute algorithms with perfect precision, they lacked intentionality, the why behind the computation. Turing recognized that she had identified the central philosophical challenge of AI decades before the field even had a name. Turing's rediscovery of her work in the 1950s sparked a slow but steady academic revival. As computers evolved from room-sized calculators to transformative tools that would reshape society, historians began to look back with fresh eyes. They realized that the conceptual leap from calculation to computation, the very leap that defined the digital age, had been articulated not by an engineer in the 1940s, but by a Victorian countess in the 1840s. Her notes were exhumed from scientific archives and studied not as a historical footnote, but as a prophetic text. The woman who had been erased by her mother and forgotten by history was suddenly powerfully relevant. Alan Turing, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, had inadvertently become the agent of her resurrection. He connected the mechanical dream of the analytical engine to the electronic reality of the modern computer, creating a bridge across time that ensured Ada Lovelace's voice would finally be heard by the generation that could build what she had envisioned. This resurrection wasn't just about giving credit where credit was due. It was about recognizing that the fundamental questions of computing, what machines can do, what thinking means, and how humans and machines might collaborate, had been asked and answered with remarkable clarity a century before the technology existed to implement the answers. Lovelace had provided the philosophical framework that would guide computing research for decades to come. The timing of her rediscovery was perfect. As computers moved from military applications to commercial and scientific uses, researchers needed to understand the broader implications of this new technology. Lovelace's notes provided a historical foundation for thinking about computers not just as calculators, but as tools for extending human creativity and intelligence. Her vision of machines that could manipulate symbols, compose music, and assist in scientific discovery suddenly seemed less like fantasy and more like a roadmap for the future. Turing's engagement with her work also helped establish her credibility in a field that was still dominated by men. When one of the founding fathers of computer science took her ideas seriously enough to debate them in his most important paper, it forced other researchers to reconsider this overlooked figure from computing's prehistory. The conversation between Lovelace and Turing, spanning a century, became a foundational dialogue that would shape how we think about artificial intelligence to this day. Her resurrection through Turing's work represents one of the most remarkable second acts in the history of science. A voice silenced by gender prejudice and historical accident was given new life by the very technology it had helped conceive. The poet who invented computing had finally found her audience, not in the drawing rooms of Victorian England, but in the laboratories and universities of the computer age, where her vision would help guide the creation of the digital world we inhabit today. As the software industry exploded in the latter half of the 20th century, creating a new professional class and cultural force, it began searching for its origin story and found Ada Lovelace waiting in the archives. The emerging field needed foundational figures, intellectual anchors for its rapidly evolving identity. Hardware had its giants, Babbage, Turing, von Neumann. But software, the art of instructing machines, of speaking to them in logical language, lacked a clear progenitor. This vacuum created the perfect conditions for Ada's rediscovery, but it also ignited one of computing's most enduring historical debates. Detractors, often pointing to Babbage's unpublished notebooks, argued that he had written algorithmic sequences before her Note G. They suggested her contribution was primarily explanatory, skillful translation and elaboration rather than true invention. To call her the first programmer, they claimed, was an overstatement born of modern political correctness rather than historical fact. This perspective gained traction in certain academic circles, particularly among those who prioritized engineering over conceptual innovation. But a new wave of scholars, led by researchers like Betty Toole and Doran Swade, pushed back with meticulous analysis of the original correspondence. Their research revealed something crucial. While Babbage had indeed created algorithmic fragments, Lovelace's Note G represented something categorically different. It was the first complete, published, and fully realized program, a comprehensive set of instructions that accounted for the machine's entire architecture, complete with loops, variables, and a defined end state. Babbage designed the instrument. Lovelace composed the first complete score for it. This academic rehabilitation found powerful cultural resonance at exactly the right moment. The emerging software industry, and particularly the growing number of women entering the field, eagerly embraced her as both symbol and precedent. She became a figure who legitimized their work, connecting the sleek monitors of the present to the ink and paper speculations of the Victorian age. Her story provided a powerful narrative about women's contributions to technology, contributions that had been systematically overlooked until now. The debate over the first programmer title, while academically significant, gradually became secondary to her symbolic power. In 2009, this culminated with the establishment of Ada Lovelace Day, an international celebration held every October to recognize the achievements of women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. This wasn't merely academic recognition. It was active reclamation. The day transformed her from a historical subject into a living icon, a catalyst for changing the present by honoring a pioneer from the past. The woman who had been erased by her mother and forgotten by history was now claimed by the very profession she helped conceive, becoming the prophet who had seen their future before they even existed. The elevation of Ada Lovelace to computing prophet inevitably prompted a necessary historical correction, a rigorous examination of what she actually contributed versus what later generations projected onto her. This modern reckoning isn't about diminishing her legacy, but about understanding its true nature and rescuing her from the twin dangers of hagiography and dismissal. The central question historians now grapple with is not whether she was important, but how and why she matters. The most persistent critique has always centered on the first programmer title. Scholars examining Babbage's unpublished notebooks correctly note that he had sketched algorithmic sequences before 1843. From this perspective, Lovelace's Note G appears as brilliant elaboration rather than pure invention. This view frames her as an interpreter and popularizer, a translator of Babbage's complex mechanical vision into a form others could understand. But this literalist argument misses the profound originality of her conceptual contribution. Modern scholarship, particularly the work of historians like Thomas Misa and computer scientist Christopher Hollings, emphasizes that her genius wasn't in writing the first lines of code, but in perceiving the computer's potential as a general-purpose symbol manipulator. Babbage designed the hardware. Lovelace envisioned the software ecosystem. He focused on building a machine that could calculate. She understood it could compose, reason, and create. Her notes are filled with what we now call use cases that Babbage himself hadn't seriously considered. The debate itself reveals a tension in how we assign credit in science history. We're accustomed to stories of lone geniuses making singular breakthroughs. The collaboration between Lovelace and Babbage was far messier and more interdependent. He provided the engineering genius and mathematical foundation. She brought a unique capacity for abstract thinking, philosophical depth, and an ability to see the forest for the trees. To ask whether the vision was his or hers misunderstands collaborative scientific progress. The analytical engine's true potential only emerged in the space between his mechanical drawings and her speculative notes. Recent analysis of their correspondence reveals something even more fascinating. Scholars examining the so-called network doodle, a previously overlooked sheet in the Bodleian Library showing paths and bridges, have identified it as a collaborative conversation about algorithmic thinking that predates formal graph theory. This suggests their partnership involved real-time, back-and-forth development of computational concepts, blurring the lines of individual authorship even further. The symbolic power of her story has become as important as the technical details. In an era when women were systematically excluded from scientific institutions, her achievements stand as a powerful corrective to the myth of the lone male genius. Her story demonstrates that intellectual revolutions often happen at intersections, between disciplines, between genders, between different ways of thinking. The attempt to reduce her contribution to a simple binary original inventor or mere assistant fails to capture what made her work revolutionary. The modern reckoning concludes that her true legacy lies not in a title, but in a way of thinking. She was the first to articulate the concept of a general-purpose computer as a medium for human thought, a machine that could extend our intellectual capabilities into new domains. Her importance isn't diminished by acknowledging Babbage's prior work. It's defined by the conceptual leap she made from his foundation. While Babbage built the engine's body, Lovelace was the first to perceive its soul. This makes her not just a computing history figure, but a foundational thinker in the philosophy of technology, whose insights into human-machine relationships remain deeply relevant as artificial intelligence transforms our world today. Her legacy remains that unlikely bridge between poetry and analysis, a testament to interdisciplinary vision that continues to shape our digital world. Subscribe for more stories of thinkers who saw connections where others saw only divisions.